Dinosaurs were not, by any means, the only ruling group of reptiles extant throughout the Mesozoic era. High above the oceanic skies, deep within the forests, across the river and lake systems, and the high cliffs and canyons of the planet throughout this time, flew the pterosaurs, occupying the skies where birds would one day soar. You will already be familiar with the iconic image of a long-crested pterosaur, Pteranodon, soaring across the waves, snatching up an unfortunate fish in its long, stork-like beak. But there's a lot more to it than this. Modern science has proved to us that pterosaurs come in all shapes and sizes, for there were an incredible number of ecological niches for them to exploit. As some of the only, and most certainly amongst the largest, flying vertebrates of their time. Throughout their long time on this planet, the pterosaurs ranged everywhere from tiny, fluttering, bat-like creatures, known as anurognathids, to the colossal asdarchids, the largest flying creatures that have ever lived. Famous faces such as Pterodactylus, Dimorphodon, and Rhamphorhynchus dominated the cliffsides and coastal water systems of the Jurassic, while lesser-known oddities such as Leptostomia, Afrotapijora, and Aramborgiania represented some of the most outlandish creatures ever to breathe. In this documentary, we will be taking an in-depth look at some of these amazing creatures, from the largest to the smallest, the strangest to the most iconic, the earliest to the latest. We will be looking into what these creatures look like, how they lived their lives, and how we know all this. Join us for a journey into the Mesozoic to take a look at the mystery and wonder of the pterosaurs. A common misconception about pterosaurs is that they were dinosaurs. Pterosaurs are indeed archosaurs, or members of the clade Avemetatarsalia, a taxonomic grouping which also contains dinosaurs, birds, and crocodilians, meaning that the two groups are distantly related. More specifically then, the pterosaurs were part of a separate clade within that, which contained the archosaurs, known as Pterosauria, which contained over 20 distinct families and over 100 individual species. Some of the smallest pterosaurs were truly tiny, a songbird-sized far cry from the giant predator reptiles most of us tend to imagine. The biggest, on the other hand, were true monsters. The largest known pterosaurs, the asdarchids, possessed 10-meter-wide wingspans that dwarfed even the very largest of modern birds. Just like the dinosaurs, many species of pterosaur have been described as being covered in a layer of soft filaments, which point to these aerial reptiles most likely being warm-blooded creatures. The pterosaurs flew using modified elongated arms, on which, stretching from wingtip to each hind limb, a series of muscle fibers grew. These fibers, which formed each pterosaur's wings, were known as actinofibrils, which were able to reorientate themselves to adapt to changes in the air current on which the pterosaur flew. The biological mastery of the pterosaur is not limited to just the wings, however. In February 2022, two wonderfully preserved specimens of the thrust-sized Wukongopterid pterosaur, Kunpengopterus from China, were described, which caused quite a stir. These creatures were found preserved with coughed-up food pellets, much like a modern-day owl's, next to them on a slab of fossilized rock in which they were found. Modern owls typically regurgitate bones, fur, scales, and any other organic matter which they cannot digest. This was conclusive proof that the prehistoric creatures that were most likely filling the ecological niches of birds of prey, such as owls, were also doing the same thing millions of years prior. The two specimens of Kunpengopterus that were found together will have been living side by side in a forested lake in the middle of Jurassic China when they died, or were killed, falling into said lake and gradually becoming covered by sediment, allowing for this high quality of preservation. From the way that these creatures were preserved, alongside their coughed-up food pellets, we can speculate on one other potential feature of these masters of the forest skies. They may have had two-part stomachs. In order to produce food pellets, creatures generally need more than one stomach part. One to digest the edible food, the other to store waste material that cannot be digested, which is ultimately forced out of a powerful digestive tract. The presence of these pellets points to some pterosaurs potentially possessing this feature, which, in turn, is further proof that there is plenty that we don't know about the creatures that are oh so synonymous with our view and knowledge of dinosaurs in the Mesozoic. Just like their distant cousins, the dinosaurs, pterosaurs also made their evolutionary debut in the Triassic period, which lasted from roughly 251 to 201 million years ago. The first evidence we have of true pterosaurs comes from the later stages of the Triassic period, from around 229 million years ago. But in order to understand their story, we have to travel back further still. Prior to the recent analysis of a very important fossil in 2020 by Martin Escura and colleagues, the evolutionary history of the pterosaurs was essentially uncharted. We had very little idea regarding how these creatures may have appeared on the planet. The fossils in question were that of a small, bipedal, lizard-like archosaur called Lagerpeten, an animal roughly 60 centimeters long and 30 centimeters tall. Known from several fossil samples, including pieces of a skull, some pelvis bones, forelimbs, and hind limbs, we can determine that Lagerpeten had peculiarly long hind limbs, giving it the appearance of something like a tiny reptilian kangaroo. It had long feet with digits of mismatching and differing sizes, very different to that of dinosaurs and birds. Taxonomically, Escura and his team have placed little Lagerpeten and its relatives much more closely to the pterosaurs, as they do in fact share multiple anatomical features with their aerial descendants. The toothless, tapering tip of the lower jaw, positioning of the forearms, and even some remains of Lagerpeten's brain have determined that these diminutive animals have a lot in common with pterosaurs. As it stands, the evidence is pointing to them being a possible direct link. How did an earthbound biped find its way along an evolutionary journey that would one day result in the mighty Quetzalcoatlus, though? Well, it is also believed that Lagerpeten and its early relatives may have been arboreal, living in the trees in a manner similar to many modern species of primate or rodent. Their long hind legs would have given them the ability to leap through the branches in search of a meal. But what happens when these trees become more and more sparse? What happens to the little animals that rely on tree hopping to survive? One possibility is that, as trees become more sparse in the areas inhabited by Lagerpeten, the little reptile needs to cover longer distances, and so developed some form of gliding mechanism. Once this was established, could this have resulted in the first instance of powered vertebrate flight seen on planet Earth, giving rise to the first true pterosaurs? Perhaps time will tell. Some of the first pterosaurs to evolve in the late Triassic, in the wake of Lagerpeten, were the Eudimorphodontids. These long-tailed coastal dwellers were small by pterosaur standards, the largest of which was roughly the size of a small hawk. It was the family Eudimorphodontidae that laid the foundation for what was to come throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, as potentially one of the first established families of true pterosaurs that would have darted across the waterways and cliff faces of the Triassic. We say potentially, as there is some debate as to whether or not these creatures were indeed true pterosaurs. or if they were a separate group entirely, known as Pterosaurs. At such an early stage, it can be difficult for scientists to accurately discern which species belongs where in a taxonomic ordering of organisms. Creatures such as the bite-sized Carneadactylus were representatives of this family, however. And this is a good example of pterosaurs possessing complex teeth with more than one clasp, which allowed the creature to chew its food more effectively. This food will likely have been coastal fish, a staple of the diet of many pterosaurs across the entire Mesozoic. The family was broadened with pterosaurs such as the larger Ostreodactylus, whose crested head may have supported a protrusion used for display amongst other members of the species. Cavy ramus, larger still, a native of what is now the Swiss Alps from the very end of the Triassic period. It would have been a swift hunter, again complete with an early crest used for display, as it picked its prey off from the surface of the water while on the wing. Throughout the Triassic, eudimorphodontids were accompanied by dimorphodontid pterosaurs, such as the Calestiventus, a small acrobatic pterosaur with a large beak and outward-facing jagged teeth. In life, it may have resembled a large beaked bird, such as a hornbill, as it crawled across the jagged rocks and cliff faces of its Triassic Utah home on all fours, before taking flights across the glistening bright blue waterways to hunt. Its European counterpart was the Italian Patinosaurus, a very small and likely agile flyer, with a relatively long, flexible tail. It's likely that, as well as subsisting on a diet of fish, Patinosaurus also may have spent a good chunk of time in the treetops, where it dug at the branches for tasty insects concealed within. The biggest pterosaurian conundrum of the Triassic, however, comes from a little creature called Faxinurlipterus. If the previous creatures we've encountered so far were small, then this one is truly tiny. With an estimated wingspan of just 25 centimeters, Faxinurlipterus was discovered in Brazil and described in 2010 as an arboreal insectivore that would have been capable of flight. Originally described confidently as a pterosaur due to the biological similarities, such as the shape of the forelimbs and the hollow nature of the bones, the claim has been met with adversity, as Faxinurlipterus was discovered to have an unfused tibia and fibula. This would be unique among all known pterosaurs, which suggests that this little animal might have diverged from the main group that produced the pterosaurs much earlier, putting it on a different little branch of this tree. We shall have to wait and see to determine where Faxinurlipterus's true family history lies. The relatively humble beginnings of the pterosaurs was taken to a new level entirely throughout the Jurassic period. All over the globe, pterosaurs began to spread their literal and figurative wings, conquering new environments and corners of the world. They became a common sight in the Mesozoic skies, and gave rise to some of the first truly iconic creatures, known to not only science, but the general public too. One of the first new species of pterosaurs to arise in the early Jurassic was Dimorphodon, a species commonly present in popular books, films, and other paleomedia, making it one of the more famous pterosaurs. Dimorphodon was known for its large skull and broad wings. It was these features that allowed us to learn a lot about how this hawk-sized pterosaur may have lived its life. Dimorphodon is named for its two types of teeth, long slicing teeth on the upper jaw and short teeth on the bottom jaw. This, combined with the powerful muscular limbs possessed by Dimorphodon, have led scientists to discern that the pterosaur most likely led a terrestrial lifestyle, just as comfortable bounding around on all fours catching reptiles and insects as it was on the wing, soaring overhead to search for food. It was the skies of the Jurassic period that first witnessed one of the most picturesquely Mesozoic families of pterosaurs evolve, the Rhamphorhynchids. As well as harboring the famous Rhamphorhynchus, the family held claim to many other iconic species of pterosaur, such as Sordes and the Scaphognathus. These pterosaurs were characterized by their sharp teeth and long trailing tails. We know a lot about Rhamphorhynchids in particular, due to the large number of perfectly preserved specimens scientists have unearthed and described. Take Rhamphorhynchus in particular, for example, a well-known creature with a long snout and jagged interlocking teeth. Many specimens of it are so incredibly well preserved that even somebody completely unfamiliar with fossil reptiles could discern what this creature would have looked like in life. Flying on a 1.8-meter wingspan, the pterosaur would have skimmed the waters of Jurassic Germany, picking off fish with its mouth full of sharp, jagged needles. These long teeth would have formed an inescapable trap for the unlucky fish falling victim to Rhamphorhynchus, making it an efficient predator. Much less specialized than some of the bizarre forms that would arise in the Cretaceous, Rhamphorhynchus was seen as a kind of large reptilian gull, a coastal generalist perfectly suited to a life on the wing. Perhaps the most bizarre of Jurassic pterosaurs were the Anurognathids. Resembling something in between a frog, a bat, and an owl, creatures such as Anurognathus, Gehalopterus, and Luopterus were among the smallest of pterosaurs. Covered in a filamentous fluff that insulated the creatures from the cold Jurassic nights, where they hawked insects on the wing, similar to modern nightjars and swifts. Their large eyes allowed them to see clearly in the dead of night, as they fluttered through the forests after the numerous winged insects they shared an environment with. The most famous of these creatures is arguably Anurognathus. With its broad wings and long whiskers, it was perfectly adapted to the lifestyle it led in the late Jurassic forests of what is now Germany. The fur-like filaments present on the wings of known Anurognathids would have muffled the pterosaur's wing beats in the quiet forest, making it a lot easier for it to sneak up on insects without being heard or seen. The late Jurassic also gave rise to Pterodactylus, one of the most famous pterosaurs from the time. With a wingspan recorded as being just over a meter in length, this was the first pterosaur ever to be scientifically reconstructed. In 1800, Johann Hermann restored Pterodactylus as a furry, bat-like creature, with a huge wing membrane. It was, in fact, Hermann who initially discerned that pterosaurs must have been able to fly on their limbs, which must have been supported by some form of winged structure between the fingers. Although he was quite far out with his initial reconstruction, we owe much of our knowledge of the appearance of pterosaurs in general to him. Studies of the size and proportions of the sclerotic rings of Pterodactylus, rings of bone found in the eyes of many vertebrates that support the eye itself, have shown that the animal was diurnal, active during the day and sleeping at night. We know the species incredibly well. Pterodactylus kept on growing throughout its life, as we have seen from the numerous specimens of both adults and infants that have been unearthed in Germany. Based on the structure of the beak and teeth, we can also deduce that Pterodactylus was a piscivore that supplemented its diet with marine invertebrates such as cephalopods, native to the German Jurassic waterways and coastlines. By the Cretaceous period, pterosaurs had blossomed into all sorts of bizarre shapes and sizes. Whilst many of them still bore resemblance to what the public would recognize as a pterosaur, plenty of them had become much more outlandish and unrecognizable. Strange filter feeders, colossal apex predators, and long-necked piscivores were not uncommon amongst their ranks, as they spread out across the globe alongside their dinosaur cousins. We can't make a video on pterosaurs without mentioning their most iconic representative, the mighty Pteranodon. Inhabiting the coastlines of the USA's western interior seaway, a large inland sea situated in what would one day become central North America, around 85 million years ago, this ruler of the sky measured 5 meters from wingtip to wingtip, and would have most likely fed on fish, diving after their quarry on immensely powerful folded wings, like modern cormorants and gannets. Even these giants had to be wary. Below them lurked numerous species of mosasaur, giant marine reptiles which could have easily posed a lethal threat to an unwary pteranodon. Across the western interior seaway, Pteranodon was by no means the sole representative of the Pterosauria clade. The bizarre but still recognizable Nyctosaurus roamed these coastal skies too, and it was certainly easy to tell them apart from Pteranodon contemporaries. Atop the skull of Nyctosaurus, which also held an impressive wingspan of 2 meters, comparable to the eagles and storks of modern Earth, was one of the most extravagant crests seen throughout the pterosaurs. A huge pole, over half a meter in length, projected from the top side of Nyctosaurus's skull, from which another pole sprouted horizontally from halfway up the first one. It was initially thought that Nyctosaurus used this crest as a huge sail, with a membrane of skin stretched across it, but no fossil evidence supports this theory. Instead, it's much more likely that the pterosaur used the huge crest in elaborate mating displays, the males with the largest and most brightly colored crests winning the right to mate. Nyctosaurus most likely flew like a modern-day albatross, soaring for long distances without flapping its wings, as a method of conserving energy and traveling long distances, as it caught fish from the surface of the western interior seaway. Elsewhere in the world throughout the Cretaceous, true oddities were evolving. In the swampy marshlands of Argentina, a relatively small pterosaur with a long neck and a wingspan of around 1.5 meters took up residence. Often reconstructed with the coloration of a bright pink flamingo, Pterodaustro is believed to have lived a life not too dissimilar from one. What sets Pterodaustro aside from the other Cretaceous pterosaurs is the way it fed, wading in knee-deep water. This bizarre creature would have lowered its head into the lapping waves and sifted through the sediment within, with long, bristle-like teeth. One of the most highly derived and specialized of all the pterosaurs, Pterodaustro would have been able to separate invertebrates from the mud and sediment below, allowing excess water to simply pass through its jaws like a modern-day flamingo. We also know that Pterodaustro acted mainly at night, again from analyses of the scleral rings. Although rather small for a Cretaceous pterosaur, it would have most certainly have been an alarming sight, as it hunched over the water, sweeping its long jaws from left to right. Pterodaustro was what has come to be known as a ctenochasmatid pterosaur, a family characterized by its penchant for water, both fresh and marine, as they flew on thin, long wings over the sweeping waves. This was a successful group of animals throughout the Cretaceous, and examples of the family can be seen across the globe. China was especially ctenochasmatid heavy, harboring multiple species, including Forfexopterus, Mogonopterus, and Beipiaopterus. Elsewhere in the world throughout the Cretaceous, a group of pterosaurs were evolving that surpassed any known dinosaur in the bizarre department. Known as the Asdarchids, these were true titans among the pterosaurs' ranks. We know of many different species of Asdarchid, some of which are rather famous faces. Giants such as Quetzalcoatlus and Hatzegopteryx have both enjoyed mainstream media appearances, and the former is popular with the public as a result. Quetzalcoatlus is the largest known pterosaur of all, roughly comparable in size to a small plane. A colossal skull was supported by a long, powerful neck, at the base of which was situated a comparatively small body for its size. It possessed giant wings, which, despite the disproportionate appearance of the animal, were likely to have permitted flight. Some theories oppose this, however, and arguments exist which claim that the largest Asdarchids, such as Quetzalcoatlus, could not fly at all, and instead rather ambled across the dramatic landscape of Cretaceous Texas on all fours, snatching up smaller animals or scavenging like a giant reptilian vulture. By the late Cretaceous, giant asdarchids were popping up all over the globe. The mighty Volga Draco inhabited what would one day become the Volga River Basin in Russia. Canada laid claim to the titanic aerial predator Cryodraken. The terrifying Aramborgiania, a creature taller than a giraffe, inhabited what is now Jordan, and the aptly named Aerotitan soared across the mountains and coastlines of Argentina. These creatures are so large that they would have been easily able to take a small or baby dinosaur as easy prey, as they swooped down from the skies on their colossal wings. Not all asdarchids were as massive as this, however, and many fossils have been unearthed that represent creatures that were much more humble in size. Radiodactylus is one such creature, which likely only held a wingspan of around 1.5 meters, a far cry from its Quetzalcoatlus and Aramborgiania cousins. This smaller pterosaur was discovered in Texas during construction work at a nuclear power plant. It likely lived a similar lifestyle to some of the larger asdarchids, prowling for food on the ground and flying more rarely than some of the more acrobatic, slight-of-stature pterosaurs of the Jurassic and Triassic. Texas was submerged by the sea at the time Radiodactylus was around, meaning that it must have lived on the cliff tops or beaches that would have surrounded the area. Scientists are still continually digging asdarchids up. In 2017, a creature was described based on a series of large neck bone fragments. Yet to be given a scientific name, this creature is lovingly referred to as the Mongol giant, a huge Mongolian asdarchid that would have inhabited the lush jungles and marshlands of what is now the barren Gobi Desert. As with all paleontology, the more specimens are unearthed, the more we're able to learn. It is thought that some of these colossal creatures might have been more suited to a frugivorous lifestyle, feeding on the numerous fruit species evolving throughout the Cretaceous. If this is true, a good modern analog for some of these creatures might be the cassowary, large relatives of the emu that live in Southeast Asia and northern Australia. These giant birds, as aggressive as they are, feed primarily on fruit and will supplement their diets with invertebrates, as well as small mammals and reptiles. The most extravagant of the Cretaceous pterosaurs were without a doubt the tapejarids. Many of these small to medium-sized pterosaurs supported an elaborate curved head crest, likely used in vibrant and complex mating displays. Perhaps the most extreme example is Tupandactylus, a rather large species of Brazilian tapejarid with a very large crest indeed. This crest was made of keratin, the same material that human hair and fingernails are made of. Proposed to be another fruit eater, Tupandactylus would have thrived in a lush coastal lagoon environment, where it likely lived in colonies atop the cliffs. Although the crests may likely have played a part in display, they also may have been used to flash signals and messages to members of the same species. Or perhaps the markings on the crests were used for one Tupandactylus to be able to recognize another amidst a busy Cretaceous sky. Afrotapejara is another prime example of what would likely have been a very impressive pterosaur. Inhabiting the tropical river deltas of Cretaceous Morocco, the appearance of Afrotapejara in the fossil record coincides with the appearance of the first flowering plants. Perhaps this brightly colored master of the air fed on the fresh fruits that grew from these plants. The tapejarid's claim to fame amongst the annals of pterosaur biology is that one of them might be the smallest pterosaur known to science so far. We say might, as there is some debate over whether or not Nemicolopterus was actually a tapejarid, but it was at least an asdarchoid, part of a wider group that included both the colorful tapejarids and the mighty asdarchids. Nemicolopterus was tiny, measuring just 5 centimeters in length, with a 25-centimeter wingspan. The sole specimen known to science was a subadult, and likely wouldn't have had much more growing to do before reaching its full size. It is likely that this tiny creature fluttered around the early Cretaceous forests of China, where it might have caught insects on the wing, complementing its diet with helpings of fruit. Alongside it lived a whole host of amazing pterosaurs. It lived in the shadows of the much larger Mogonopterus and Liaodingopterus, as well as a diverse selection of dinosaurs such as Sinotyrannus, a large theropod. The bizarre diversity of the Cretaceous pterosaurs did not stop there, however. Look at Leptostomia, for example. This was a pterosaur not too dissimilar in terms of body plan from some of the giant asdarchids, but it was only 50 centimeters tall and was not a direct relative. What's more is that these little pterosaurs were owners of long, probing beaks, very much like modern wading birds. Think of sandpipers or oyster catchers, for example. It's likely that these little creatures would have lived in the coastal wetlands and mudflats, alongside famous giant dinosaurs such as Spinosaurus, using their long beaks to probe the sediment for invertebrates along the water's edge. The Sungoripterids, known from fossils unearthed in Asia and South America, are equally strange to the human eye. These creatures, similar again to the asdarchids, were rather large, and many were most likely aquatic predators. They lived and hunted in the waterways of the Cretaceous, where they picked off freshwater fish and invertebrates with sharp, upturned beaks. Their skulls also supported elaborate crests, which will have given them a bizarre facial appearance in comparison to some of the more modest-looking pterosaurs we know of. Creatures such as the Sungoripterus, Domacodactylus, and Longchognathosauros were examples of this group, which may have resembled water birds, such as gulls, grebes, and waders in life. Another group of pterosaurs that's certainly worth exploring on the final stop of this tour are the large albatross-like ornithochirids. Some of these prehistoric masters of the cloud were really rather large. One of the largest known ornithochirids, with a wingspan of around 8 meters in width, was Tropiognathus. Others such as Ornithochirus, Mythunga, and Arthrodactylus were known to be around 4 or 5 meters from wingtip to wingtip. What makes these creatures special is their extremely long wings relative to their body size. Much like a modern albatross, it is suggested that these great creatures would have migrated many, many miles, possibly even across the globe, to mate or find new feeding grounds. That food would have included the fish that shoaled in the Cretaceous seaways, only aware of the huge, curved jaws closing either side of them once it was too late. Think of the diversity among the bird world today. It's not unreasonable to think that many of the pterosaurs would have filled those evolutionary niches we associate modern birds with as the largest group of flying vertebrates alive at the time. Large carnivorous species, oceanic piscivorous species, forest-dwelling frugivorous species, and small wading species are all known. There is a lot more to the world of pterosaurs than meets the eye. Many of us will recognize the Pteranodon depicted in the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World franchises. Scaly, bat-like creatures hell-bent on aggression and killing. As always, the natural world is much more nuanced. Many different species of pterosaur existed that we're just learning about now, and they're presenting a whole new world of knowledge to us. Sure, there will have been pterosaurs that will have been dangerous, but this doesn't represent the whole group of animals. It's likely that many of these animals would have been timid and shy, living in the shadows of larger creatures. Almost as diverse as the dinosaurs they lived and evolved alongside, the pterosaurs are surely equally as interesting as their famous cousins.